The fluorescent lights of the city library hummed a tired, buzzing song, a sound that usually meant peace. But not tonight. For 9-year-old Maya, it was the soundtrack to a closing cage. The heavy glass doors at the front had been locked by the evening librarian, a woman with a kind face and distracted eyes, now lost in the administrative ballet of shutting down for the night. Maya was supposed to have been picked up 30 minutes ago, but her father's texts had become a familiar string of apologies and delays. "Just a little longer, sweetie. Stay inside where it's safe." Safety, however, had just walked out of the history aisle. He moved with a silence that was unnatural for a man of his size. Mr. Abernathy, the man whose name was on a bronze plaque in the children's wing, the generous donor who funded the summer reading program. His shoes, always polished to a mirror shine, made no sound on the worn linoleum. She only knew he was there when his shadow fell over the book she was pretending to read. "Still here, Maya?" His voice was smooth as honey, but it made the hairs on her arms stand up. "Your father is a busy man. It's a shame to leave a little girl like you all alone." Maya's world shrank to the space between them. The smell of his cologne, a sharp, cloying scent of sandalwood and something else she couldn't name, filled her nose. It was the smell of dread. She didn't look up. She kept her eyes fixed on the page, a story about a brave knight, but the words swam into meaningless black shapes. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a small, bony cage. She felt unseen, a ghost in her own life, but he always saw her. He had a special talent for finding her when she was most alone. "Come now," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "No need to be shy with me. I have something special to show you. In my office, I have a first edition of The Secret Garden. The illustrations are exquisite. We can look at it together while we wait for your father." His office wasn't in the library. It was in the building next door, the one with his name on it in gold letters, the one that was always dark and empty after 5. Her mother's voice, a fading echo in the quiet corners of her memory, whispered a single, urgent command. "Trust your gut, Maya. It never lies." Her gut was screaming. It felt like a cold, hard knot of ice in her stomach. She shook her head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. "My dad said to wait here." Her voice was a squeak, barely audible over the hum of the lights. Abernathy's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. The warmth in them was a painted-on thing, thin as veneer. "Nonsense, he won't mind. I'm a friend. I'm here to help." He reached out, his hand large and heavy, and placed it on her shoulder. His touch was not violent, but it was possessive, an anchor of fear. "Let's go. We don't want to keep the librarian waiting." He was steering her toward a side exit, a heavy metal door that led to the alley between the buildings. The main doors were glass, but this one was solid steel. No one would see. The librarian was at the front desk, her back to them, counting the day's till. Maya's breath hitched. This was it. The moment the vague, creeping dread became a sharp, physical certainty. Her feet felt like lead, but his hand on her shoulder propelled her forward. The metal of the door handle was cold against his skin as he reached for it. The alley outside was a slash of darkness, slick with a fine misting rain. There would be no one out there, no one to hear, no one to see her disappear. The night in her book felt 1,000,000 miles away. There were no nights here. There was only the hum of the lights, the smell of his cologne, and the terrifying, final click of a closing lock. Maya's silence was a fortress she had built brick by brick over the past year. It started the day the world went quiet, the day her mother's laughter vanished from their small apartment. Her father, A man who had always been a mountain of warmth and goofy smiles crumbled into a ghost haunted by his own grief. He worked double shifts at the plant, chasing overtime to fill the hours that were once filled with his wife's presence. He would come home smelling of grease and exhaustion, kiss Maya's forehead, and retreat into the blue glow of the television, a silent sentinel in his worn armchair. She learned not to need things, not to ask for help with homework, not to mention the kids at school who made fun of her second-hand shoes, not to complain when her stomach growled because she'd forgotten to pack a lunch. Needing things seemed to add weight to her father's already stooped shoulders. So she became self-sufficient. She learned to make her own toast, to walk to the library after school, to do her homework in the quiet hum of the children's section until he called to say he was on his way. She became an expert in being invisible, because being invisible meant being no one's burden. The system designed to see children like her had failed to penetrate her fortress. A school counselor, Ms. Gable, had called her in once. She had a kind face and a shelf full of psychology books. "How are you adjusting, Maya?" she had asked, her pen poised over a form. Maya had shrugged. "I'm okay." She didn't cry. She didn't act out. She got good grades. On the form, Ms. Gable checked a box. Coping well with loss, quiet but resilient. The silence was mistaken for peace. The invisibility was mistaken for strength. But her mother had left her one weapon, a gift more valuable than any inheritance. It was the memory of a conversation on a sunny afternoon in their small backyard. Maya had been 6, and a neighbor's friendly-seeming dog had nipped her hand. When she'd cried, her mother hadn't just kissed it better. She had sat her down, her eyes serious. "Some things look friendly, sweetie, but they make your tummy feel funny. That's your gut. It's the smartest part of you. It knows when something is wrong, even if you can't explain why. You have to promise me you'll always, always trust that feeling." Maya trusted it now. The feeling had started as a flicker the first time she met Mr. Abernathy. He had visited her classroom, a local hero reading a story. All the other kids were mesmerized, the teachers were fawning. But when his eyes had landed on her, a cold dread had trickled down her spine. He'd praised her drawing, a little blue bird, calling her a special, talented artist. But his smile never reached his eyes. After that, he was everywhere. At the library, he would appear by her table, offering her special books from the restricted section. At the park, he would be there, telling her she shouldn't be playing alone. He bought her ice cream once, and when she tried to refuse, he'd insisted, his voice hardening just enough to make her comply. He learned her routine. He knew her father worked late. He knew she was alone. Each encounter was a small, calculated step closing in on her. She had tried to tell her father once. "Mr. Abernathy is weird," she'd mumbled over dinner. Her dad, distracted by a stack of bills, had just patted her hand. "He's a very important man, sweetie. He does a lot for this town. Be nice to him." Being nice was the price of admission to the world. But her mother's voice was the counter-argument, a ghost of a warning that had grown louder and more insistent with every passing week, until it was a deafening roar in the silent, terrifying space of the library. He was not a friend. He was the friendly dog with the hidden teeth. And now, his hand was on her shoulder, leading her into the dark. On the industrial edge of town, where the neat suburban lawns gave way to warehouses and chain-link fences, sat a nondescript garage. The sign was faded, reading Odin's Forge, but the building itself was immaculate. Inside, the air smelled of metal, oil, and lemon polish. This was the clubhouse of the Sons of Odin Motorcycle Club, but it bore no resemblance to the chaotic dens portrayed in movies. There were no overflowing ashtrays, no empty bottles, no raucous noise. There was only the quiet hum of focused work. 3 men moved with the practiced economy of a seasoned crew. John, known to everyone as Bear, was the club's president. He was a mountain of a man, with a thick beard and arms covered in faded tattoos from his time in the service. His hands, large enough to palm a basketball, were methodically polishing the chrome fender of his Harley-Davidson, his touch surprisingly gentle. He worked in silence, his presence a grounding force that filled the entire space. His calm was not a passive thing. It was a deliberate, disciplined state of being. Across the garage, David, or Doc, sat at a sturdy wooden workbench. A pair of reading glasses perched on his nose, he was reviewing a sheaf of legal papers. Before he'd traded his paramedic's uniform for a leather cut, he'd been on the front lines of human misery. A job that had taught him 2 things: how to patch up a body and how to navigate the labyrinth of bureaucracy. He was the club's strategist, their medic, and their conscience, the one who translated their code into practical action. He was helping a fellow veteran fight the VA for benefits he was rightfully owed. And in the corner, almost a part of the shadows, was Marcus, called Ghost. He rarely spoke, but he saw everything. He was lean and wiry, with eyes that seemed to hold a permanent record of things best left forgotten. He was sharpening a set of wrenches, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel the only sound he made. No one knew much about Ghost's past, only that Bear had found him drifting, and that his loyalty was absolute. He was the club's early warning system, a silent observer whose instincts were razor-sharp. Their vests, their cuts, were clean and hung neatly on hooks. They only wore them on official rides. Stitched over the heart of each leather vest was a small, unassuming patch, easily overlooked. It depicted a shield and a sword, but beneath it were 2 words in Latin: Innocentia vindicata, the innocent vindicated. It wasn't a boast, it was a vow. It was the founding principle of their brotherhood, forged in the crucible of their own pasts. Bear had seen the ravages of war and the children left behind. Doc had treated too many kids brought into the emergency room with injuries that didn't match their parents' stories. Ghost's history was a closed book, but his fierce, unwavering protectiveness of the vulnerable spoke volumes. They were not outlaws. They were guardians who had created their own system of justice when the official ones had failed them. Their weekly meetings were not for planning mayhem, but for organizing charity toy runs, volunteering for community projects, and quietly extending their protection to those who had fallen through the cracks. Tonight, they had just finished a quick stop for coffee, a brief respite before heading home, when the sky had opened up in a sudden downpour. They were parked across from the library, waiting for the rain to slacken, the low rumble of their engines a counterpoint to the quiet patter on the pavement. The side door of the library swung open, a rectangle of harsh yellow light cutting through the deepening twilight. For a moment, 2 figures were silhouetted against it, a large man and a small child. Even from across the street, the tension was palpable. The girl's posture was rigid, her head bowed. The man's hand was clamped on her shoulder. Ghost's head came up, his work forgotten. His eyes narrowed. He saw the girl's free hand, a tiny fist, unclench for a split second. Something small and white fluttered to the wet pavement, landing just at the edge of the puddle-strewn curb. The heavy door clicked shut, plunging the alley back into near darkness. The man, Abernathy, began guiding the child toward a sleek, dark sedan parked in the shadows. His movements were smooth, confident, but Ghost was no longer watching him. He was already swinging his leg off his bike. He walked across the street, his boots silent on the asphalt, and bent down. He picked up the small, folded piece of paper. It was damp, but the image on it was clear. It was a child's drawing, rendered in crayon. A tall, smiling man with a mouth full of sharp, triangular teeth. In his hand, he held a birdcage, and inside it, a small blue bird wept a single, oversized tear. Ghost turned the paper over. On the back, 3 words were scrawled in the shaky, earnest print of a young child. 3 words that changed everything. Help me. Ghost walked back to the bikes, his face an unreadable mask. He didn't say a word. He just held the drawing out to Bear. Bear took it, his large thumb brushing against the damp paper. He looked at the drawing, then at the words on the back. His calm expression didn't change, but a switch flipped behind his eyes. It was a look of cold, absolute clarity. He glanced at Doc, who had already seen the drawing over his shoulder. The 3 men exchanged a look that transcended language. It was the activation of a code, a shared understanding honed over years of watching each other's backs. The toy runs, the charity work. Those were the quiet parts of their vow. This was the other side of it. Across the street, Abernathy was opening the passenger door of his sedan. He was trying to coax Maya inside, his voice a low, insistent murmur. She was resisting, her small body pulling back. A silent, desperate tug of war. Bear, Doc, and Ghost started walking. They didn't run. Their pace was unhurried, a slow, deliberate advance that was far more intimidating than any charge. The rhythmic scuff of their heavy boots on the wet pavement was the only sound. They crossed the street as one, a solid wall of leather and resolve, and moved into the alley. Bear didn't reach for Abernathy. He didn't raise his voice. He simply positioned his massive frame between Abernathy and the open car door, blocking the path. He was an immovable object, a human barrier. His shadow fell over both Abernathy and Maya. Abernathy looked up, startled. His mask of affluent charm snapped back into place instantly. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. He sized them up, the leather, the beards, the sheer size of them, and dismissed them as common thugs. Bear's voice was a low rumble, devoid of threat, but heavy with meaning. The girl looked scared. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact. Abernathy's smile tightened. "She's just shy, a bit overwhelmed. I'm a friend of the family, Mr. Abernathy. I'm just giving her a ride home. Her father is running late." He placed a proprietary hand back on Maya's shoulder. Maya flinched at his touch and, without thinking, took a small step back, her leg pressing against the solid bulk of Bear's jeans. She instinctively sought the safety of the larger shadow. It was Doc who spoke next. His voice was calm and educated, a stark contrast to their appearance that seemed to unnerve Abernathy more than any growl would have. "She dropped this," Doc said, holding up the small, damp drawing. He held it so the image of the man with the shark's teeth was facing Abernathy. For one fleeting, almost imperceptible moment, Abernathy's composure fractured. His eyes darted from the drawing to Maya, and a flicker of pure, venomous rage crossed his face before it was smoothed over again by his practiced smile. But they had all seen it. Ghost, who had moved to stand slightly behind Abernathy, saw the man's knuckles whiten as he gripped the car door. The power in the damp, dark alley had just shifted, silently and irrevocably. The air grew thick with unspoken truth. The diner was an island of light and warmth in the rainy night. The smell of coffee and frying bacon hung in the air, a comforting antidote to the cold dread of the alley. The 3 bikers sat in a booth, a strange trio of guardians surrounding a small, shivering girl. Bear had ordered her a hot chocolate, and she was holding the warm mug in both hands, her eyes fixed on the miniature marshmallow whirlpools swirling on the surface. They didn't press her. They let the silence stretch, giving her space to breathe. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "He's always there. Doc leaned forward slightly. Mr. Abernathy? She nodded, taking a shaky sip of cocoa. At the library, at the park, he says he wants to be my friend, but it doesn't feel like a friend. She looked up, her eyes wide and earnest. He has special books he wants to show me. In his office, he says I'm his special girl. Each word was a small, sharp piece of glass. Bear's jaw tightened, but his expression remained gentle for her sake. Doc, his mind already working through legal angles, knew this was a classic grooming narrative. But it was also a child's word against that of a powerful, respected man. It was hearsay. It wouldn't be enough. Maya, Doc said softly, did he ever show you these books? She shook her head. I always say no, but tonight he wasn't asking. After getting her father's number, Bear made the call. It was a difficult conversation. Maya's father, reached at the plant, was initially defensive, then bewildered. Abernathy, no, he's a pillar of the community. You must be mistaken. But the raw fear in Bear's description of finding his daughter and the mention of the drawing planted a seed of doubt. He agreed to meet them, his voice strained with a dawning horror. When her father arrived, his face ashen, Maya ran to him, burying her face in his work jacket. The sight of his daughter clinging to him, truly terrified, shattered his denial. The bikers stepped back, giving them space. They weren't here to replace her father, only to bridge the gap his grief had created. The next morning, Doc made a call of his own. Detective Frank Miller was a 20-year veteran of the force, a man with tired eyes and an allergy to polished facades. He listened to Doc's story over the phone, his silence filled with a professional skepticism. Bikers reporting a potential child predator? It sounded like the setup to a bad joke. So, you're telling me a prominent philanthropist is a monster because a little girl drew a scary picture and your biker gang got a bad feeling? Miller's voice was dry. I'm telling you, Doc replied, his tone even, that we have a terrified 9-year-old child who was being led into a dark alley by a man who has systematically isolated her. I was a paramedic for 15 years. I know what the beginning of a nightmare looks like. All I'm asking is that you look quietly. Something in Doc's steady, intelligent voice cut through Miller's cynicism. He had seen too many cases where the monster wore a suit and a smile. Abernathy, you said. I'll run the name. No promises. The bikers' next stop was Maya's school. They didn't go in. Bear waited by the car while Doc, dressed in a simple collared shirt and slacks, went to find her teacher, Ms. Albright. She was a young teacher, earnest and overwhelmed. When Doc mentioned his concern about Maya's interactions with Mr. Abernathy, a flicker of recognition crossed her face. It's funny you should mention that, she said, lowering her voice. He's a major donor, so we're all supposed to be grateful. But he gives me an odd feeling. He sponsors an after-school art club, and he always gives Maya extra attention. He calls her his protégée. I told myself it was nice of him to take an interest, but it always felt off. She's become so withdrawn this year. I thought it was just her mom. Doc left his card with her. If you remember anything else, anything at all, please call me. Or Detective Miller. The pieces were beginning to form a picture. Miller's initial background check on Abernathy came up clean on the surface. Awards, charity board memberships, glowing press. But digging deeper, Miller found a faint, troubling pattern. He cross-referenced Abernathy's name with school districts where he had previously been a major donor. He found 2 families with daughters Maya's age who had abruptly moved out of state in the last 5 years. One of the girls had been in counseling for severe anxiety. It was thin, circumstantial, but it was a pattern. The biker's instincts in Maya's drawing were no longer isolated data points. They were the start of a map, and Detective Miller, against his better judgment, was starting to believe it led somewhere very dark. The sons of Odin did not wait for the system to work. They trusted Miller to do his job, but they had their own code to uphold. They began a silent watch. It was a strategy they had perfected over the years, a form of nonviolent psychological pressure. Wherever Martin Abernathy went, a biker was there. When Abernathy attended a fundraiser at the country club, Ghost was parked across the street, polishing his bike, his gaze a silent, constant presence. When Abernathy visited the children's wing of the hospital for a photo opportunity, Bear was in the waiting room, reading a magazine, an immovable mountain of quiet judgment. They never spoke to him. They never threatened him. They never broke a single law. They simply existed in his periphery, a constant, leather-clad reminder that he was being watched. The community began to notice. At first, it was just whispers. Why are those bikers always hanging around? Then, Abernathy's own paranoia began to make him sloppy. He would snap at people, his polished demeanor cracking under the strain of the silent surveillance. His powerful friends on the city council and various boards tried to intervene. The chief of police received several calls complaining about biker gang harassment, but each time, the responding officers found the same thing. A man, or two men, quietly and legally occupying public space. "They're not doing anything, sir," became the standard report. Just being there. Abernathy, enraged and feeling his control slip, tried to get a restraining order. In court, his lawyer argued that his client felt intimidated and threatened. Doc, acting as the club's representative, stood before the judge. He didn't look like a stereotypical biker. He looked like a calm, articulate man. "Your Honor," he said simply, "my friends and I enjoy the public spaces in this town. We are patrons of the library. We enjoy the park. Is Mr. Abernathy suggesting that his presence in a public place makes that place off-limits to other citizens?" The judge, finding no evidence of threats, harassment, or illegal activity, dismissed the petition. The failure was a public humiliation for Abernathy, and it emboldened others. The quiet ripple of their watch turned into a wave. A former secretary from one of Abernathy's foundations, who had been fired after questioning his mentorship expenses, saw the bikers and felt a surge of courage. She contacted Detective Miller. She told him about Abernathy's private server, the one he kept for personal files, and how obsessive he was about its security. That was the linchpin Miller needed. Armed with the secretary's testimony and the pattern of families who had fled, he convinced a judge to sign a warrant, not for Abernathy's house, but for his office, specifically for the server. The raid was quiet and professional. The tech unit took the hard drives. The public reckoning began when the story broke. Prominent philanthropist Martin Abernathy under investigation. The town was stunned. Abernathy was a fixture, a man synonymous with charity and civic duty. The community fractured. Supporters rallied to his defense, writing letters to the editor decrying the witch hunt instigated by violent thugs. Skeptics, who had always found Abernathy too slick, watched with cautious interest. And in quiet homes across the city, a few people, parents, former employees, other children, felt a cold knot of fear loosen, replaced by a fragile spark of hope. The sons of Odin's silent watch had done more than rattle a predator. It had held up a mirror to the community, forcing it to see the monster it had refused to acknowledge. The gears of institutional justice, rusted from disuse, were finally, slowly, beginning to turn. The day of Martin Abernathy's arrest was gray and overcast. the sky mirroring the somber mood that had settled over the town. The evidence recovered from his server was sickeningly conclusive. A meticulously organized collection of images and a digital diary detailing his grooming of dozens of children over 2 decades, including Maya. His public mask was incinerated in an instant, revealing the predator beneath. The trial became the town's focal point, a public dissection of its own willful blindness. The courtroom was packed every day. Abernathy, now thin and sallow, sat beside a team of expensive lawyers, his air of superiority replaced by a venomous glare. For Maya, the summons to testify was a terrifying prospect. The thought of facing him, of speaking the truth out loud in front of a room full of strangers, made her feel small and fragile all over again. Her father, now a constant, worried presence by her side, held her hand. "You don't have to do this if you can't, sweetie," he whispered. But Maya, thinking of the drawing of the caged bird, knew she did. The sons of Odin were there. Every single day of the trial, 4 of them, Bear, Doc, Ghost, and another member named Brick, occupied the same 4 seats in the back row. They didn't wear their cuts, the leather vests that identified their club. They wore simple dark clothing, jeans, work shirts, clean jackets. They were silent, their faces impassive. They were not there to intimidate the jury or the judge. They were there as a wall, a silent, solid wall of support at Maya's back. When it was her turn to take the stand, Maya's legs felt like water. She walked past Abernathy, refusing to look at him, and climbed into the witness chair, which felt vast and lonely. The prosecutor's voice was gentle, but the questions were hard. "Maya, can you tell the court what happened on the evening of October 12th at the library?" Her voice was a tiny thread of sound. She recounted the events, her words faltering. She could feel Abernathy's stare burning into her. Her throat closed up. She looked down at her hands, twisting a loose thread on her dress. The prosecutor paused, giving her a moment. In the silence, Maya's gaze drifted to the back of the courtroom. She found Bear. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't offering a thumbs up. He simply held her gaze, his expression one of absolute, unshakable belief, and gave her a single, slow nod. It was a gesture that said, "We are here. We believe you. You are not alone." It was all she needed. A current of strength flowed through her. She sat up a little straighter. She looked at the prosecutor, then at the jury. Her voice, when she spoke again, was clear and steady. She told them everything. About his cloying cologne, the way his smile never met his eyes, the cold knot of fear in her stomach. She told them about the drawing, and the cage, and the bird. She spoke her truth, and the courtroom was utterly silent, hanging on the words of a 9-year-old girl who had found her voice. Her testimony opened the floodgates. Inspired by her courage and the undeniable proof of the digital evidence, other victims came forward. 2 were now women in their late 20s, their lives shadowed by the trauma Abernathy had inflicted. They took the stand and told their own stories, each one a chilling echo of Maya's. The pattern of grooming, manipulation, and abuse was laid bare, undeniable and horrific. The verdict came after only 2 hours of deliberation. Guilty, on all counts. As the word was spoken, a collective gasp went through the courtroom. Abernathy's face crumpled into a mask of pure, impotent rage. He was no longer a philanthropist or a pillar of the community. He was just a convicted predator, his legacy reduced to a docket number. Maya didn't watch him get led away. She felt a small hand slip into hers. It was Doc. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze. She looked at her father, who was openly weeping with relief, and then back to the 4 silent figures in the last row. They didn't cheer or celebrate. They simply stood, watched her for a moment to ensure she was safe, and then quietly filed out of the courtroom. Justice had been delivered. Their work here was done, but the echoes of what they had started were just beginning to spread. The conviction of Martin Abernathy sent a seismic shock through the town's foundations, cracking open the complacent facade of safety. But the sons of Odin and their allies knew that one man's imprisonment was not the end of the story. True justice required not just punishment but reform. The system that had failed Maya, and countless others before her, had to be rebuilt. The first and most immediate change was the implementation of what became known colloquially as the Maya Rule. Spearheaded by a now mobilized group of parents and a deeply remorseful library board, the new policy was simple and ironclad. No single adult staff member, volunteer, or donor was ever to be alone with a single child in any non-public area of a library, school, or community center. All interactions had to take place in open, observable spaces, or with a second vetted adult present. Doors to offices and back rooms were to remain open during any one-on-one tutoring or mentoring. It was a structural change that removed the shadows where predators like Abernathy thrived. Detective Miller, leveraging the high-profile nature of the case, successfully lobbied the city for increased funding and staffing for the Special Victims Unit. He used the Abernathy case as a textbook example of how grooming often went unnoticed and how under-resourced departments struggled to connect the dots on long-term patterns of abuse. He instituted new training protocols for all patrol officers, teaching them to recognize the subtle, nonverbal cues of a child in distress, the kind of silent signals that Ghost had seen in Maya. Inspired by the effectiveness of the bikers' Silent Watch, Miller worked with community leaders to establish a formal, town-sanctioned neighborhood watch program. But this was a new breed of watch. Trained by Miller himself, the volunteers were taught non-confrontational observation and reporting techniques. They learned how to be a visible, calming presence, and how to document suspicious activity legally and effectively to provide actionable intelligence for law enforcement. The Sons of Odin were invited to the first training session, not as subjects, but as honored consultants. Bear, uncomfortable in the spotlight, gave a short, gruff speech. "You don't need a leather jacket to look out for a kid," he said. "You just need to pay attention." The media attention around the case brought the Sons of Odin an unexpected level of fame, and with it, a flood of donations from people across the country who were moved by their story. Doc, ever the strategist, saw an opportunity to build something lasting. They established the Vindicated Foundation, a registered nonprofit. Its mission was twofold: to provide pro bono legal aid and advocacy for child victims in criminally underfunded jurisdictions, and to offer grants to small, struggling child advocacy centers. Doc ran the legal side, using his knowledge to build a network of volunteer lawyers. The foundation's logo was a subtle, stylized version of the drawing Maya had made. A small blue bird, now flying free from an open cage. Perhaps the most profound change happened within the four walls of Maya's own home. The trial had been a brutal awakening for her father. Staring into the abyss of what he had almost lost, he was finally shaken free from the paralysis of his grief. He quit his second job, took a cut in pay, and enrolled in therapy. The conversations between him and Maya were awkward at first, full of long silences and unspoken apologies. But he was present. He listened. He learned to cook her favorite meal, mac and cheese with extra butter, just like her mom used to make. He started showing up to pick her from school, not just on time, but early. One afternoon, he found her old drawing of the man with the shark's teeth. He looked at it for a long time, his face a mixture of shame and gratitude. He didn't throw it away. He filed it carefully, a reminder of the lesson his daughter and a group of unlikely guardians had taught him. Grief was not an excuse for blindness. The process of rebuilding their family was slow and imperfect, but it was real. The silence in their apartment was no longer one of absence, but a comfortable quiet, filled with the steady, reassuring presence of a father who was finally home. 1 year later, the late afternoon sun cast long golden rays through the open bay door of the Odin's Forge garage. The space was still immaculate, still smelled of polish and oil, but it had a new addition. A small, brightly colored art station set up in a clean corner. This was Maya's corner. She was no longer the silent, shivering child from the diner. She was 10 now, her face full of light, her ponytail swinging as she chattered away to Ghost, who was patiently showing her how to properly sort a set of metric sockets. Her fear had been replaced by a bright, easy confidence. The garage had become her second home, a sanctuary of rumbling engines and quiet strength. The men of the club, once intimidating figures, were now her uncles, her protectors, her family. She helped Doc file paperwork for the foundation. She debated the merits of different comic book heroes with Brick, and she sat with Bear, sometimes in comfortable silence, other times telling him elaborate stories she had invented. Today, she had a new drawing for him. She walked over to where he was rewrapping the handlebar grips on his bike and held it out. It wasn't a picture of fear. This drawing was vibrant with color. In the center was a huge, smiling brown bear, and surrounding him, holding his paws, were figures representing Doc, Ghost, and the other members. In the very middle of the circle, held securely between the bear's gentle paws, was a small girl with a wild ponytail, smiling broadly. Above them all was a bright yellow sun. Bear took the drawing, his calloused fingers surprisingly delicate. He looked at it for a long moment, a slow smile spreading beneath his thick beard. "It's good, kid. Real good." He pinned it to the corkboard on the wall, a board already covered with her art, a vibrant gallery of her healing. She looked up at his massive form, her head tilted. A question had been sitting in her mind for a long time, one she finally felt brave enough to ask. "Bear?" "Yeah, Maya? That night, why did you help me? You didn't even know me." Bear stopped his work. He looked from her earnest, upturned face to the corkboard, then back. He could have given her a long speech about duty, about his past, about the failures of the world. But the code of the sons of Odin was not about speeches. It was about action and simple, unwavering truth. He reached up and tapped the small, unassuming patch stitched over his heart, the one with the shield and the sword. He pointed to the 2 words embroidered beneath it. "Innocentia Vindicata." "It's the code," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. He then looked her right in the eye and added the only other words that mattered. "And you're one of ours." The final image of that day, the one that would become a new and better memory, was of the brotherhood on the road. The engines of their Harleys thundered in a synchronized rhythm as they rode down a long, open highway, the setting sun at their backs. On a scenic overlook, a small car was parked. A man and his daughter stood by the guardrail. As the motorcycles approached, the girl, Maya, raised her hand and waved with her whole body. Her father stood beside her, his arm resting protectively on her shoulder, and he waved too. A chorus of deep, resonant honks answered them from the road. It was a greeting, a promise, a celebration. Maya watched until the last bike disappeared around a distant curve, their chrome glinting in the final rays of sunlight. She was safe. The world, her world, was safer. The brotherhood rode on, leaving a healed heart and a quiet, profound legacy in their wake. The camera of memory holds on the empty road stretching toward the horizon, a symbol of a future that had been reclaimed, a promise that had been kept.